Well, good morning. Good morning, everybody. I'm Morton Blackwell, president of the Leadership Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this, our May Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. We live in interesting times. Yesterday was May Day, you may know, which is traditionally the time for the left to try to take over the streets, not just in this country but around the world. And the left in other countries managed to generate some fairly massive demonstrations, particularly in France, where they hope that the new president of France is going to be a member of the Socialist Party. But they made a major effort in the United States. The Obama's Occupier movement exercised its muscles and scheduled demonstrations attempting to disrupt many major cities in the country. But it fizzled. Today's Washington Times story has the headline, "Occupy Forces Regather on May Day." The article, and this isn't the Washington Times article, this is one they used from the Associated Press. Here's how it begins. Hundreds of activists across the U.S. joined the worldwide May Day protest. Hundreds of them. That is maybe damning them with faint praise. I don't know. The truth is that they have failed miserably with this Occupy movement. People of America have come to understand that Obama's occupiers are the scum of the earth, and they are suitable for employment only at Acorn offices. In 2012, the Leadership Institute has already trained 3,720 students, and since 1979, the Institute has trained over 106,845 students. You have before you on the goldenrod paper a list of currently scheduled schools. This is only a fraction of the schools that we are going to be holding this year. Last year we trained 11,800 people in over 300 individual training schools of our 41 types. I urge you to look at that schedule and identify training programs that you might wish to attend, or pass the information on to friends of yours. This is an extraordinarily busy time for us, and the Institute is doing well on essentially all fronts. It's now my pleasure to present to you Peter Ildefonso, who will lead us in an invocation and pledge of allegiance. Peter is the Institute's technology support technician, and he's a graduate of Clemson University. Peter?
In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord, you teach us that in your scripture that we should, if we find an enemy or an evil doer, we should give them food if they are hungry, and water if they are thirsty. And Lord, you tell us that if we are to find evil, that we should treat them with good, and that shall be not only our vengeance, but how we shall master evil. Lord, we ask you that you continue to make the leadership a force of this good, and that the staff and the students that we train continue to reach out and make this good throughout the world. We thank you for our blessings, including the food in front of us, including the loved ones that we have, and including the surroundings that we are in. We also thank you, Lord, for our greatest blessing, which is the donors that make it so that we are able to continue going forward and to fulfill this actual mandate of yours. And it is through this good through which we shall indeed master all evil. Amen. Rise for the pledge.
Thank you very much for that, Peter. And now I present to you Aaron Reese. He is director of the LI Studios, and he's going to give a report on our newly renovated studios, which are directly above us on the 4th floor. Aaron is a graduate of the University of Illinois, and he has a BFA in photography. Step forward. Thanks, Aaron.
Morning. I'm Aaron Reese. I'm director of studios upstairs. I'm always surprised whenever I tell somebody about the studios upstairs and they say, I wasn't even aware that there was a TV studio on your 4th floor. I'd encourage you all to take the studio tour, or not just the studio tour, but the building tour at the end where they can show you the studios if you guys are interested in seeing it. I want to talk to you this morning about what our goal is at the Leadership Institute. I know that you hear a lot from the programs department, so just to change it up a little bit, I was going to tell you about the studio department. Our main goal there is to bring people in and give them a on-camera television experience before they have to go on some TV network. So they get experience of doing this and then delivering their message, and they can develop it before they go on air. If you could show them one picture here. Within the last year, we've completely renovated the studio to high definition. So this is our studio setup here. We bring somebody in and they talk to a media trainer. That's our other set there, which has a Seamless on it, so we can do videos for other organizations in the area. So we've been doing things for media training, the on-camera experiences. We've been recently offering within the last year online classes for the Leadership Institute, where you can log on to our Leadership Institute website and watch a speaker give a lecture on fundraising or running a campaign or something like that. And then lastly, we work with a number of other conservative organizations in the area. I just want to draw your attention to one in particular. Within the last year, the Institute for Humane Studies has launched learnliberty.org, and about 90% of the videos on the website have all been shot in our studio against the Seamless White. And we've edited several here, and then a bunch of other editors have edited them. So we're doing our best to promote conservatism through online media. And then lastly, I want to talk to you a little bit about, we just did a studio upgrade upstairs, and after this last upgrade, we're still waiting on the furniture, but after this last upgrade, we're entirely high definition at this point, which is a phenomenal studio space for a conservative organization to have. So if any of you haven't seen the studio or weren't aware of it, I really encourage you to take the building tour when you're all done. I'll go back upstairs and I'll show off some of the things that we just recently got. You guys can check it out. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Aaron is highly competent and a pleasure to work with. And if you have TV-type things, he could advise you, and perhaps we could be of some use to you here at the Institute. And now I present to you Christopher Doss. Chris is a grassroots coordinator here at the Leadership Institute. He is a terrific lecturer, widely experienced in politics. Last Saturday, I was down, Chris, at the Republican Congressional District Convention in the 9th District in Wytheville, where you hail from, I guess, and many people came up to me and said that I was certainly lucky to have you working for me, and I agreed fully. Chris is a graduate of Wake Forest University and Norway's University of Oslo. Chris, come introduce our speaker.
people think I talk funny because I'm from Southern Virginia. Men du borde höra mig, men jag pratar norsk. I hope many of you enjoy reading Dr. Rahn's articles in the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Times, but I want to hearken back to his origins and remind you of the 4th of July, 1776, when our founders in Philadelphia made public a document bemoaning the busybody government of George III. It contained these words: "He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance." One of Dr. Rahn's best articles, he may argue with me on this, but one of my favorite that I like to share with candidates is in May of 2010 when Dr. Rahn published an article on the current busybody government that's eating out our substance. And his article pithily illustrates why our government is in the state it's in. And for just one brief excerpt: big government is a bloated mass of contradictions that often have unexpected harmful consequences. Listen to this. Politicians scold citizens for consuming too much sugar, but the government provides subsidies for producing high fructose corn syrup. Government subsidizes farmers for growing crops and no crops at all. Government subsidizes home ownership and restricts the number of homes that can be built. Officials criticize business executives who take on too much debt, but government encourages debt by providing tax deductions for interest, but not for equity capital. And of course, the government itself is deeper in debt than anybody else. Officials complain that companies invest so much money overseas, but the government imposes a tax on earnings brought back to the United States. Officials bemoan our dependence on foreign oil while restricting U.S. drilling. Businesses can be prosecuted for predatory price cutting if they charge too little, price gouging if they charge too much, and price fixing if they charge the same as their competitors. There are laws that make it more difficult for people to hire people, and laws that provide income for the unemployed. Officials say they want more doctors while enforcing laws that limit the number of students who can enter med schools. Close quote. Dr. Richard Rahn, a member of the most important organization in the world, no, not the Federal Reserve Bank, the Mont Pelerin Society, and I learned today he was a friend of Hayek. He is published widely, including the Times and the Wall Street Journal, has been heard in thousands of broadcasts. I'm sure you have seen him as I have. An advisor to presidents. And I have one question for Dr. Rahn today. Based on all the reading I have done of his work, I think in addition to the many presidents that he lists on his bio, he may have been an advisor to an earlier president based on this quote I found from an earlier State of the Union address. "No pecuniary consideration is more urgent than the regular redemption and discharge of the public debt." Inquiring minds want to know, Dr. Rahn, did you write that line for President Washington?
Chris, thank you very much. Yes, I'm almost as old as Morton. Actually, I've known Morton for about 30 years, and just hearing a bit on your studio, I want to thank Morton and all of you here at LI, because a few years ago was when YouTube first became popular. Preston Carruthers, you may know, who built a lot of the buildings here in Arlington, and I were having lunch one day, and Preston is a wealthy man, having owned a lot of apartments and things here. And we were amazed that the guys who started YouTube, I think they sold it for several $1 billion. They started like 18 months beforehand. And Preston said, how does that happen, you know? And so we got talking, and so we decided to try to do some videos of having basically young women narrators talk about economics. And it was another older woman who actually suggested using young women, because she said guys like to look at women like to look at women, and a way of getting basically the college students and younger people to look at these videos was to use young women as narrators. And my colleague Dan Mitchell was a very fine writer and a great tax economist. He writes most of the scripts, and they do the taping here. And I thank you, Morton, and all of you who've got the studio. It's worked very well. We get a lot of hits on these things. It's a low-cost operation, and it's just one of the many examples of the kind of support that LI gives to all the sort of free market conservative organizations, and I thank all of you. Now, Morton and I do go back a number of years, and one of my favorite people in history is Winston Churchill. And there was an incident recently, it brought him back to mind. And after Sir Winston left the prime ministership for the last time, he thought he should take a cruise. And he picked an Italian liner. And some of the people from the BBC were most upset about this. And a reporter comes up to him and said, well, Sir Winston, why are you taking an Italian liner when the Queen Elizabeth is a perfectly serviceable ship? And Churchill responded. He said, well, there was 3 reasons. First, the cuisine on an Italian liner is superb. The service is magnificent. And in case of an untoward event, there's none of this nonsense about women and children first. And as we see, the tradition still stands. And for those of us who like traditions, I said Morton and I go way back, and Morton knows most of my life I've been very much an optimist about economics. And you know, we got through the Jimmy Carter years, and we had Reagan, we changed things, and Morton was very much part of that. And we really had a magnificent 25-year run in the United States and globally. Unfortunately today, I'm going to give you a rather pessimistic message because you look at what's been happening. Now, I look at this group here. I can tell, responsible people, and none of you would spend 40% more than you earn year after year after year, would you? Those of you who have businesses, you know you would be in trouble if you spent 40% more than your revenues year after year after year. We all know the consequences of excessive spending in our personal lives and our business lives. Well, the same thing is true of governments. For many years, we were able to hold deficits in 3% or under. And as long as your economic growth rate is more than 3%, you can have a deficit of 3%, and your debt-GDP ratio does not rise. During the Reagan years, people complained about the rise in the deficit. But we had much higher economic growth than we did in the increase in deficits. And actually, our GDP debt ratio fell during the latter years of the Reagan administration after the economic recovery took hold. And that can really continue to fall up until very recently. In 2007, our debt-GDP ratio was only 36%, very manageable. But then we got into this notion of these trillion-plus dollar deficits. The debt of the United States has grown 50% in the last 4 years. It's not only the US, you take a look at every major country in the world, and the growth in debt, virtually with all of them, is exceeding their own economic growth, which means their debt-GDP ratios get bigger and bigger and bigger. When you first got out of school, many of you had debt, and as long as your income grew faster than the additional debt you put on, you were fine because you could handle that debt. And that's the way we were in the United States. We had deficits. I like close to a balanced budget, but there's no necessary to balance it each year, but you gotta be close, as long as that growth rate's higher. But we take a look right now. Japan, most of Europe, the Brits, the French, the Spaniards, the Italians, and even the Germans are in a serious debt deficit situation. Who would have thought the government of the Netherlands, we always look at them as very sober, responsible people, would have fallen 2 weeks ago? It is getting worse and worse each day. And until governments decide to fully cut back, the situation we can only go sort of the way of Greece. When I say the way of Greece, Greece defaulted on their debt. Now, we all knew this was coming. There was all this denial, and finally, was it 6 weeks ago, finally the default became official. Greece was in a position where they didn't print their own currency. So they couldn't cover the interest payments on their bonds, so they defaulted on the bonds. And if you owned a Greek bond, well, I don't feel bad for you because you should have known not to own a Greek bond, because the Greeks, you know, they don't work, they retire early, and they get big benefits, and you know that leads to disaster. Sort of like your own kids, you know, they'll keep spending your money as long as you let them. And finally you have to say no. And so Greece went over the cliff, and you see other countries are going to be going over the cliff. And we're watching Spain unravel now. It's hard to see how they get out of their mess, because these democratically elected governments seem to be incapable of delivering the harsh medicine that is needed. And politicians have for years been promising things they couldn't deliver. We look at our own country. Our gross debt now is slightly greater than our GDP as of last month. Our net debt's up about 78% and rising rapidly. But the unfunded liabilities for Social Security, and particularly Medicare and Medicaid, is now 121 trillion. Our GDP is a little under 16 trillion. But again, the unfunded liabilities are 121 trillion. The explicit debt is 16 trillion. Now, you don't have to be a math whiz. In fact, if you got through the 5th grade in math, you can see there's a problem there. And it's a problem, it's not going to be resolved in, some people say, well, we need tax increases. Tax increases do not cure a spending problem. And there's no way you can tax your way out of this. Greece is a prime example. They were demanding more and more taxes out of the Greeks. You know, it kept increasing the tax rates. And I kept saying, well, if the Greeks won't pay a tax rate of 45 or 50%, what makes you think they're going to pay a tax rate of 70%? The Greeks, last year, they put a tax on home swimming pools. 13 people paid the tax. One of the young tax analysts in the Greek tax administration then pulled out a Google map and started counting the number of private pools just in the Athens area, and he came up with more than 5,000. But only 13 people actually paid it. People will not pay high tax rates. They're going to find either legal or illegal ways to avoid it. I'd served on the board of directors of the Cayman Island Monetary Authority as the first non-Caymanian. And so I have somewhat of an expertise in offshore financial centers. I just came in from Belize last night, and they're talking about trying to make themselves more investment friendly. But capital moves. And when Obama says, oh, he wants to greatly increase taxes here, the so-called Buffett rule, that's absurd. There's no way they're going to get Warren Buffett to pay 30% tax. I'm willing to bet anybody here, I'll give you odds of 10 to 1, it will never happen. To have Warren Buffett pay 30% tax, you first of all have to increase the capital gains tax at least to over 30%. Now, we know that the revenue maximizing rate for the capital gains tax is less than 15%. We've got plenty of empirical evidence of this. Our colleagues over at Institute for Research in the Economics of Taxation, former Treasury officials and others, have all clearly demonstrated this. We've had the empirical examples going up and down because it's largely discretionary tax. And it would, a 30% capital gains tax would do enormous damage because then you also have to add on the state taxes. Here in Virginia, we give no break for capital gains at all. I keep complaining that. I'm on the governor's economic advisory board, and it's one of my perennial complaints about the capital gains tax here in Virginia. But anyway, by the time you get this done, a lot of states, you'd be up around 40%. Nobody says that a 40% capital gains tax is anything but greatly over the revenue maximizing rate. You know, the sole idea of the Laffer curve. Another thing, to get Warren Buffett to pay that tax, you'd have to abolish tax-free interest from state and municipal issues. How many states want to give up the tax-free issuance of these bonds? Because that enables them to borrow at a lower cost. It's not going to happen. So this is just, you know, it's outrageous pandering by our president when he goes out there and says these things. And it's very hard not to get mad every time I listen to the man. Even worse, we have a Secretary of the Treasury by the name of Tim Geithner, who is the worst Treasury Secretary perhaps in our nation's history. Now, despite your assertion, I don't remember all our Secretaries of the Treasury, but in my lifetime, he is undoubtedly the worst. Do you know what they've done over the last month? The IRS, which falls under Treasury and Geithner, they've issued 2 regulations, an interest reporting rule for forcing U.S. banks to report to foreign governments of the deposits in U.S. banks by foreign citizens. They made U.S. banks tax collectors for foreign governments. And we're supposed to pass information along to these foreign governments. So you have somebody fleeing Venezuela. They move a lot of their money to the U.S. because they know what happens under the Chavez regime. And here, the U.S. Treasury is forcing U.S. banks to reveal who has deposits, Venezuelans, to the Venezuelan government. I mean, this is not only economic madness, it's immoral, it's criminal. And I mean, I've written a lot about this. I've got an article yesterday in the Washington Times on this. You just can go to the, you can go to, I'm a senior fellow at Cato. You can go to cato.org and pick it up, or our Institute for Global Economic Growth, IGEG, or just look at the Washington Times website if you want to pick it up and take a look at it. But there's this other provision, many of you probably have heard about, FATCA, Foreign Accounts Compliance Transaction Act. And what this does, it greatly penalizes any foreign financial institution which happens to have a U.S. tax person, can be a U.S. citizen, green card holder, or there's other ways you can become a U.S. tax person. And if you have one of those people as in your as an account holder, you can be subject to both civil and criminal penalties if you do not reveal this. Now, there's a little problem here. Let's say Morton walks into a bank in Austria, and he comes in and he says his name is Morton Popoulos, and that he's a Greek citizen. He shows a Greek passport. He speaks Greek. He shows he's got a furniture business in Athens, and clearly he looks Greek. And they open an account for him. They think he's Greek. Little do they know he also has a U.S. passport or green card. Those bankers then are held criminally and civilly liable. So what happens? they're not going to open accounts or invest in the U.S. And so we're seeing now a flight of capital out of the U.S., and this is going to accelerate after January 1st when the whole regulations go into effect. We have more than $10 trillion of foreign portfolio investment in the U.S., that's stocks and bonds. Much of this comes through foreign financial institutions, where they're going to stop and they're going to pull out of a lot of that, which is going to cause millions of American jobs. To give you an example of the total overreaching of the Geithner Treasury and IRS, the oldest bank in Switzerland is Wegelin and Company in St. Gallen. It was established in 1747. The head of the bank is a fellow named Conrad Hummler, did his PhD at the University of Rochester. I said he's an old friend of mine. I don't know, maybe Morton's met him. Morton and I have a close mutual friend, Faith Whittlesey, who was our ambassador a couple of times to Switzerland. Conrad had been head of the Swiss Bankers Association. He runs a newspaper in Switzerland, one of Switzerland's leading citizens. Well, when these regulations came up, Conrad decided he would divest himself of all his U.S. accounts and also not have any nexus at all with the U.S. and not invest in the U.S. And he was very vocal about this and attacking Treasury and so forth and saying, you're just driving me out and I'm getting rid of all my U.S. accounts. So it takes a while to unwind these, you know, because you have people who have had accounts for many years. And so in January, the IRS indicted 2 of his employees for supposedly encouraging people to open accounts in Wegelin Bank, even though the official policy of the bank, and I know Conrad, and I know he was trying to get rid of the U.S. accounts, was the accusation was they encouraged U.S. People to put accounts in the bank, which is nonsense. And then Conrad screamed loudly about this because then people got panicked and a lot of people started to withdraw accounts from his bank. He had to sell the bulk of the bank to Raiffeisen, German-Austrian bank. And this is a bank that's been around since 1747. And then they attacked Conrad directly. Now, this is a Swiss bank, has no operations in the U.S. at all. No offices, no employees here. It follows Swiss law. The Swiss have never said they violated anything. They followed Swiss banking law. You've got the U.S. indicting them. Now the problem is when the U.S. attacks, then all banks need corresponding banking relationships. And so any bank who also is in the U.S. who deals with Wegelin, they can be under attack. And some of you know Peter Wallison, who used to be General Counsel of the Treasury, who's been doing a lot of wonderful work about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the Dodd-Frank bill and all the costs. And he gets the feedback, and he was just telling me the other day of things where U.S. government officials have threatened U.S. banks who speak out against any of these Dodd-Frank regulations of how they're counterproductive and undermining us. And they're getting threatened. They're just Chicago thugs. These are horrible people. I wrote yesterday, if Geithner and Schulman, who's head of the IRS, were in the private sector, they did these things, they would likely be indicted and convicted and be in jail is where these guys belong. And people don't understand how bad it is. Let me give you another example. I'm sorry to be so angry this morning. This is not my normal thing, but I am angry about this. John Stossel and I did a program about a month ago, and they're still putting out some of the excerpts of it. And John had gotten the banking regulations, and they're about almost as high as this lectern. These are just, like the IRS code, tens of thousands of pages. Now, there's all this thing. I said the banks is too big to fail. We can't allow big banks to be too big to fail. Think if you got a neighborhood bank, a local bank, and I've been a stockholder of a small one in Florida, been on a bank board years ago, a couple dozen employees. Now, in one of these community banks where they serve the local homeowner, the local businesses in towns, you know, they're not big operations. We have 8,000 of these banks. Who in the world is going to read all this stuff, understand it, and be able to comply and set up the compliance programs? Well, no human can. And so, of course, the government says, well, then go off and hire accountants and lawyers to do all this. But if you're a small bank, you can't possibly afford that. And so what we're doing, we're forcing small banks to merge and sell themselves out to big banks. At the same time, we say we don't want these big banks. This is madness. And it goes on and on and on. The global situation. I know I'm running out of time here. A few more things. Okay, a few more things about the global situation. So we have this going on in the U.S., but it's all over the world. A colleague of mine, who's a doctoral student out of George Mason University, and I decided to take a look at which countries in the world actually have sustainable fiscal policies now. And by a sustainable fiscal policy, I mean where they worked out their entitlements so they're not going to eat the entire budget in the way that our entitlements are. You're all aware of that. Where their GDP deficit ratio is manageable and where it's not increasing. Okay, so we looked at all the developed countries or semi-developed countries in the world, basically democracies. We left out the very poorest countries, the petrostates in the Mideast, but of normal economies. What did we come up with? In Europe, only 2 countries, Switzerland and Sweden. Norway is also in good shape, but that's a petrostate. In the Americas, Chile and Canada. In Asia, Australia, Taiwan, South Korea. That's it for the entire globe. The rest are all headed off the cliff unless they make really radical changes, and we don't see the sign of the radical changes coming. It is possible to make radical changes in democracies, and we have 2 good examples, Sweden and Canada. The Swedes had a very high growth rate from about 1870 to 1970. But during the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, they tried to do their third way. They built a welfare state. They nationalized a lot of things. Economic growth slowed down. Debt got bigger and bigger. By 1995, they were facing a Greek-type crisis. But the Swedes, being somewhat sensible, both the parties, the left and right, came together and they said, we got to change. We're going to go off the cliff. And they did. They greatly lowered tax rates. Their tax rates are still too high in my judgment, but they're quite flat. They didn't make the mistake we did where we say 50% of people don't pay the income tax. And there's very little difference between the highest and the lowest tax rates. So anytime a Swede wants an additional benefit, they know they're going to have to pay for it. They went to a voucher system for schools, like Milton Friedman had been proposing for years. So any Swedish family now, you've got a daughter or a son, you have a voucher, and you can have your choice of public schools or private schools. They went to the Chilean model for the Social Security system, which is like a big expanded 401k. So Sweden now has himself on a sustainable route. Switzerland has always been sensible and it continued to be sensible, and their government's growing slowly, but it's all manageable. Chile, of course, put in the reforms. Our friend Jose Pinheiro designed that change the Social Security system. And despite, they have some ups and downs, but they've been doing quite well. And Canada made the big reform also in the mid-90s. Like Sweden, the Canadians had been getting relative poorer to the U.S. Remember, the Canadian dollar had fallen against the U.S. dollar, and our northern neighbors were becoming poorer and poorer. They were accumulating in debt. And again, the parties of both the left and right came together, and they started making radical changes in Canada. And they started reducing the size of the government, doing some deregulation, some tax cuts, particularly in business. The Canadians now have a federal corporate income tax of 15%. Ours is 35%. Now, if you're going to open a new business, I had a little semiconductor company here in Northern Virginia I was chairman of. We built that almost 20 years ago now, 18 years ago. And if I had that to do over again, would I set it up in Northern Virginia or would I put it in Toronto? I mean, assume you've got a business which you have a global market for, you can produce the product in a number of countries. Would you pick the US any longer? I mean, if you're up in New York State, would you pick Buffalo or Toronto? It's not rough, you know. Toronto's a nicer city, much more well-managed, lower crime, and Buffalo, of course, is a mess. And it's all due to economic policies of the federal and state government. We're making ourselves poorer in the same way the Canadians and Swedes did before 1995. We're just about run out of time here. Morton remembers this back in 82 and 83. I was a member of the Social Security Advisory Council under Reagan, the 4-year quadrennial commission, and we were looking particularly at Medicare during those years. And we said we had maybe 30 years at most before the string ran out. Well, the 30 years is up, string has run out, and over this next couple of years, there's got to be a downsizing. This can't continue. The U.S. is it has a bit of advantage for at least a number of months because Europe is in worse shape. So we have a flood of capital out of Europe to the U.S., which is covering over some of our mistakes. But this will not go on. Within the next 2 years, I think we'll hit the wall. I can't tell you the day, the month. I mean, you never know triggering devices. We were talking about the First World War. Who would have thought of the assassination of an Archduke in Sarajevo? I actually went and looked at the bridge there last year to take a look at where he was actually assassinated. Anyway, and that started the whole mess. But there'll be some event, and then the whole thing will unwind rapidly. We have a few minutes for questions. I apologize for giving you such a pessimistic message. I hate doing that, but I don't want to lie to you, unlike our president. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for a brilliant presentation. Actually, the last time I heard you speak, you were on your way to China, and I'm curious to know if you could offer up some comments regarding what you observe over there. Thank you.
Yeah, Jim Miller and I went to China together. I think you all know Jim had been former head of OMB and a number of other things. And we were supposed to be meeting with the new Chinese leader, economic leadership's going to take over. And we had a very interesting time. And Jim and I on a plane on the way back and said, okay, what do we know? Nothing. The most insightful comment I had in the way was for a woman who was a senior economist at the central bank, said to me, she'd also worked for the Fed and for the IMF, trained here in the U.S., and of course spoke perfect English and would have fit in well with here in the group. And she says, well, I now buy my shoes when I'm in Washington because they're cheaper there. And the one thing I had noticed, because I always go off and walk the streets when I'm in these foreign cities to try to get an idea of what real prices are and what's really going on. And the prices are high in China. And this whole thing that the Chinese currency is undervalued, I didn't believe it beforehand. And after being there, I know it's basically not true. And the Chinese have their own problems. One thing was interesting in one of these cities we were in. Again, I was just walking the streets, and there's all these new high-rise condos and everything. And you had people along the street hawking apartments, and you can buy them or sell them. Just like Miami, they had little booths, and because the prices are dropping, they have the overbuilding. They've got a property bust going on. And I don't know how bad this is going to be, but China's not going to be the great savior, even though it's booming along, because the inherent contradictions of having their communist system. And, well, Morton's a member of Mount Pelerin, too. And many years ago, we had a session at Mount Pelerin in a discussion of how high your per capita income needs to be before people will no longer put up with dictatorial regimes and demand democracy. And we saw it happen in Singapore and Taiwan and South Korea and other places. And the Chinese are getting up to that. I mean, there's about 250 million Chinese or so have a U.S. middle class standard of living or higher. I mean, you go through, there's huge amounts of prosperity there. But after you have, your new car and your nice place to live and all the good foods and the nice restaurants, you want something else called freedom. And so how this is going to play out, I've dodged your question because I don't know how to answer it, so I just talk like a politician. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to listen to a guy named Trumka the other day who was talking on a board, and I was interested to hear his analysis of why we can just do whatever we want. We're the richest country in the world, and it's just a matter of allocation of our resources. I mean, I'm just summarizing. It was longer than that. But that sounds almost to me like he's advocating confiscation.
Well, confiscation, if things started being confiscated, you people aren't going to invest and everything dies. I mean, we could turn the place around, the U.S. around. We know it has to be done. We've got to make the changes to the entitlements. And nobody wants to face that reality. Another thing that irritates me about our Republicans in the Congress, even all the new Tea Party people, the House can stop a lot of stuff. They can stop a lot of spending and a lot of the regulations. I did a little laundry list of just things that don't even cost very much, but are bad things going on that the House could stop. Because both houses of Congress have to vote for any spending. We're still fully funding the OECD, even though it is trying to jack up taxes for us with the IMF and UN. There's a whole number of these international agencies, and we're still spending money on it. This isn't big bucks, but why are our people continuing to vote for this stuff? And we keep sending notice up there and just say no. And they get intimidated. I mean, people come in, and I don't agree with Ron Paul on everything, but at least he says no. And, we got to stop. And they give all these excuses, and I'm not anti-John Boehner. I've known him over the years, not a bad fellow. But he's into this culture of going along and trying to compromise. And you can't do this. The string has run out. And our guys have got to have more backbone and guts. And they say, well, this will shut down the government. Good. I mean, we shut down the government, they lose, we win. And just because you're going to be beat up on the nightly news and Chris Matthews will have twitches doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. Yes, sir.
I have another IRS horror story for you. You realize they're trying to put the small tax practitioner out of business.
Oh, yes. I've written about it.
Licensing, education requirements,
Yeah.
Pay for your license requirements. The rationale I heard was they thought they had 300 people in the country who might be doing fraud, so they were going to punish the 30,000 instead of indicting the 300. In the Navy, we had an expression for that. It's called the floggings will continue until morale improves.
Yeah. This is a totally outrageous thing. They're saying, oh yes, we're at the IRS are going to license of who can fill out your tax form for you. First of all, it's outrageous that everybody can't fill out their own tax forms. I mean, what kind of thing? When you have, another quote from Winston Churchill was, 10,000 regulations mean there is no law. And I've often said it in the past. Now, how many of you can remember the whole 10 Commandments? I don't ask you to raise your hand. We're not going to do a test here. But if I said write down the 10 Commandments now, some people here might have a struggle. Okay, the IRS has some hundreds of thousands of regulations. And if you people don't know them, you can go to jail. Now, getting to the gentleman's point, okay, you're going to have a test to see who knows the IRS code. And, you know, the IRS is constantly sending out these little notices, a little deficiency notice, you know, a few $100 there or whatever it is. And so last year I had one of these things, and I thought I was right. So after numerous phone calls, I finally reached a human at the IRS. Somebody claimed they were human. And it had to do with a rollover in retirement account. And I know a little bit about tax, and so I went through my argument with her, and I could tell she didn't know anything about this. And I said, do you have somebody there who I can discuss it with who understands the whole code? And in order not to waste my time, I want you to put somebody on the phone who understands the entire 77,000 pages that I am legally required to know, and it seems to me if you're an employee of the agency, you should be able to provide me with such a person. Of course, they could not. So the IRS is incapable of filling out your tax form because they don't understand it and it's contradictory. And the notion of licensing people to understand something it cannot be understood is tyranny. I used to work a lot, as Morton knows, in the former Soviet Union and during the transition before and everything. One thing tyrannical regimes do is pass so many rules and regulations that if they want to target you, and let's say, Chris, we don't like Chris here, so we're going to find something he did wrong. And right now, we're all at that point, because if the government decides to target us, I'm betting that everybody in this room has committed some felony that they didn't know about. There are more than 8,000 federal felonies now. You can't possibly know all this stuff. I live in Great Falls. A number of years ago, I put a little pond on my property, and I've got goldfish in it, and my kids liked it. But I was informed if I ever fill in the pond, then, you know, that's a felony, because then I'm destroying a waterway that I created, or a water, whatever. I mean, this is madness, and the thing is, it's tyrannical. And I've written a lot about this, and like this piece I did yesterday saying Geithner and Schulman belong to be in jail. I mean, they're probably going to go after me one of these days, and I'm hoping, you know, you at the Leadership Institute will occasionally send me a little care package if that's allowed. Yeah, yeah. I mean, but this, we laugh, but this is terrible stuff going on. And we have to say no to this. I mean, 8,000 federal felonies. I once tried to test myself and see if I could put everything we ought to have in law in one sentence. And I thought it came down to, I paraphrase myself here, won't have it perfect, but no one has a right to interfere with any other person's person or property without their permission, nor do you have the right to engage in theft, fraud, misrepresentation. Doesn't that virtually cover everything we have? If we just had that one little rule, I think we can put it all in one sentence, and I may have left something out there. But I tested to say, okay, what's in this sentence that doesn't cover everything we need to know? And the rest is all superfluous. It's nothing more than giving bureaucrats control over our lives. Our founding fathers, and I had ancestors who fought in the American Revolution, and they were fought over a 3% tea tax. And we put up with this crap today, and I am fed up with it, and I'm too old to carry a gun, but I still have my pen, as long as I'm still published, and people like you all will put up with me speaking, I'm going to speak on it. But we've got to say no. And our friends who are elected to the Tea Party, not one of them should vote for the federal budget. Part of changing is just saying no to the budget. Any budget that exceeds, the spending exceeds revenues, they should say no to. And they put that down as the marker. They've got to say no to funding these regulatory agencies. I mean, we read about all the endless stuff that comes out of EPA and things. Well, EPA couldn't do this if they didn't get any funding. And they have a budget each year. And why are our people voting for funding for the EPA until they change? And I think we ought to say no. No regulation without a thorough cost-benefit analysis, both for new regulations and existing regulations. And you ought to say to the EPA, and Lisa Jackson, and all the other totalitarian bastards out there, stop. We will not fund you. I'm sorry, I realize this is a very liberal group, and I'm going over the...
I don't intend this to end. You got our full attention, but I did want to ask a question myself. Is this on now? Can you hear now? All right. You've pointed to a precipice that we're heading toward, and the fall off the cliff could happen at any point,
Yep.
maybe 2 years down the road.
Maybe next week.
That's right. Now, assume that you have lived a long and reasonably successful life, and you have established assets, and you have what is reasonably these days thought of as a balanced portfolio of investments, some stocks, some bonds, some in cash, some in real estate, et cetera. And you knew for sure that we were going to be having economic chaos in this country in 2 years. Could you suggest what somebody might do to protect himself and his family and the wealth that he has accumulated over the years? Now, I don't know if you're licensed as an investment advisor, but give us, can you give advice?
Well, I'm happy to give advice even though I'm not licensed, because I don't think one should have to have a license to be an investment advisor. And if they want to throw me in jail for that, so be it. Anyway, I think probably the best single investment is guns, because they tend to have a higher resale value, particularly in times of crisis when people really need them. And they have the big gun shows out here at Dulles Airport, and I was thinking, what is probably the best single asset? Well, guns. I mean, I think it's better than gold. If you've got enough guns, you can acquire the gold. Another good deal is bags of rice. I was trying to figure out what kind of reserves you have. I actually, a more serious note here, I have actually experienced, been in countries, went through a total financial collapse, Eastern Europe and other things. Much of my professional career has been working with countries in crisis. And these things tend not to last for years. I mean, it's a number of months you have to get through. And I know I've got plenty of friends who've got the cabins up in the mountains. You still have your cabin? Anyway, with the guns and everything. And, you know, and some people try to prepare for 30 years. No. 30 years, we're either dead or we've succeeded, you know. It's talking about a number of months. So, you know, we have these wonderful Asian supermarkets around here, and they have these big bags of rice. You know, often they have Korean symbols and things on it, but the rice is grown in Louisiana and Texas. And bag of rice, you know, you can eat, for a 40-pound bag of rice, I think it's like $26, and you can eat a long time. There's a lot of calories in a 40-pound bag of dried rice. So you can, you know, a few of those things around. But on the investments, none of us knows what will work and what won't. And, you know, you can watch Kudlow and look at all the investment gurus, and they all have the contradictory advice, which means nobody knows. And I get to Switzerland fairly often. I got some friends that are Swiss bankers, and I'll say, hey, guys, what are you investing in? Because I'm trying to figure out. And they're saying, Richard, what are you investing in? You know, because nobody knows. So I think diversity and looking at things, not everything's going to go to zero. Global equities, they'll go down, but well-managed corporations, global corporations, because every day they're trying to figure out how to survive also and grow. And so having some of that, I'd sure stay away from government bonds for the longer run. I mean, bond traders can make money in the short run, but you just know that government bonds, most government bonds are going to go Zippo at some point. They're not good long-term investments. Good real estate one thing I think the U.S. has an advantage with the rest of the world, we still really haven't, we still protect basic real property, and I think it really would cause a revolution if they started grabbing our farms and homes and things. Again, you know, trying to find reasonable things, diversity, and do it diverse globally, because you don't know which places are going to succeed and which fail, and that's about the best you can do. Things will get worse, and the trick is, you know, your your standard of living is likely to go down. You just hope it doesn't go down as fast as the other guys, and that's the trick. Yes, ma'am.
Wanted to make one comment and then ask a question. The comment is, in my community, you can't have clotheslines. Somehow that's against the zoning, and I think that's wrong. My question is, when you were mentioning the countries that have done well economically, in the Western Hemisphere, I remember you mentioned Chile and Canada and Sweden. Was that it?
Well, Sweden and Switzerland. I said in the Americas, Canada and Chile. In Europe, Sweden and Switzerland.
And I'm thinking of, you know, particularly Sweden and Canada. They're countries with much lower population per their ability to bring in income, I think. And I mean, I'm not an economist, but how can countries with more people and, you know, more unemployment problems, does that add an added dimension to the problem?
No. No, actually, I mean, it's not the size, it's the policies. And I like some of these microstates. I've just in Belize, 330,000 people. We're looking at doing some economic transition there. I like places like that. They're very manageable. But the U.S., the U.S. has everything going for it. Despite what Obama says, we have more energy than any other place in the world. We have more coal, more gas. We have huge amounts of oil, if we could just drill it. We've got the best infrastructure transportation system in the world. We have bountiful farmlands. We have everything going for us. But if we could just take Washington and, well, the earthquake we had here in Virginia, it's too bad it wasn't right under Washington and just dropped the whole city for a while there. Of course, they've spilled over here in Northern Virginia, which is a problem for us. But, I mean, the problem is right here. And we need to totally redo the Fed and have choice in currency and a lot of things I can give for our lecture on the Fed. And with the regulatory agencies and tax, I mean, it's not, we know what to do. Morton and I could sit down in an afternoon and have this worked out.
Give one more question.
Yes, hi, Brian Barnett. I had a question. When these countries you mentioned, left and right, got together, the two different parties, and worked it out, was there a certain type of leadership on one side or the other that made that possible? Because it seems like left and right in this country is getting further apart in contentious as opposed to coming together and working together.
There are parliamentary systems in both countries. And I mean, first of all, the populations in both countries were well educated. People know what was going on. They could see handwriting on the wall. And our problem here is, I think part of it is educational standards have fallen. There was an interesting piece the other day of looking at what Republicans and Democrats actually know, and how Democrats, for the most part, I mean, it was a huge gulf of things they just basically don't know. I mean, the kinds of, I mean, everyone here, I'm sure, knows there's a problem with our entitlements. The Democrats are still in denial, and they just say, oh, it's not a problem. And it's like, I sometimes think, okay, elect Obama for the next term. Just see what will happen, because the collapse, I mean, the part of the things we face, we got this huge tax increase coming in January 1st, not only the Bush taxes, but a lot of others. It amounts to 3.5% of GDP. if we don't change that before January 1st, we can definitely say the first quarter of next year is going to be horrendously bad. Do we want that on our watch? And if Romney wins, we've got to get those tax changes done in a lame duck session. And the question is, will the Democrats even allow that? I mean, we have a party, it's in denial or worse. And there's a wonderful YouTube video out there. If you wanted the United States to fail, and somewhere the link, it just ought to take a look at it because it gets right to the point. They're doing policies out there, and whether it's they really want us to fail or they're just stupid or don't care, I don't know. But it's scary. Anyway, I didn't give you an answer to the question, but that's okay. Thanks.
Can you give us any word of hope? Something?
Oh, yeah. What happens after the collapse, things do come back.
Yay!
I chaired the Bulgarian transition team back in 1990-91. And Bulgaria was a total collapse. The currency was dysfunctional, hyperinflation. You go there, it's a nice place now. Estonia is the great success of the transition countries. Multiple times the income. And it's interesting, the Eastern European countries are in much better shape than Western European countries because they already went through it. And they know there isn't a free lunch. The French are about to learn that.
Richard, thank you so much for coming. It was a spectacular presentation, and I'm sure that if you could rely upon our meter maids in Arlington not to tow your car away, they'd keep you here for a long time. As a token of appreciation, I want to present to you one of our Adam Smith ties, not the one you have. I don't know if you have the green one.
No, actually, I have to confess, Morton, I revealed to your staff, I said my green one had worn out. This is sort of the George Mason, Ed Meese version. And the reason it sort of wore out because my colleague Dan Mitchell and I often used to do a lot of speeches internationally together. And Dan was always forgetting his tie, and I loaned him the tie. And it was like the only tie he wore for like 3 months, and he didn't take good care of it. So I'm very glad now to have a green one back, because then I have the full collection. And I thank you very much and for all the good work the Leadership Institute does.
Thank you so much. I'm almost certain that you know this, but you talked about so many regulations and laws and people breaking them, whether we know it or not. But I have frequently made use of what I believe is documented and true, and that is that the head of the Soviet secret police, I guess it was called the KGB then, the most famous one under Stalin was a guy named Lavrentiy Beria. And he was, shortly after Stalin died, Beria was assassinated, but he was a great pillar of the totalitarian regime in the Soviet Union. And he reportedly once said, in addressing this problem, to Stalin, "You show me the man, I'll find you the crime." And that's the situation that we certainly don't need in this country. It is my pleasure to invite you to join us on Wednesday, June 6th, our next Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast, and our guest speaker will be Congressman Joe Wilson. That will be fun. And as was said earlier, we are now going to organize a tour for any and all who are interested, a tour of the Leadership Institute building and our building next door. Trey McKenzie, who is a great guide. Trey, could you step up here? Are you? Where's Trey? There. Oh, where's Trey? Okay, John Pariba is going to give you the tour I don't know what happened. Here's John. Step up here so they can see you. John will lead you on a tour, and I thank you all for attending, and particularly thank my dear friend, Dr. Richard Rahn, for gracing us with his presence and his wisdom.